being a mother means giving up everything. But what happens when all you get in return is ingratitude? If you've ever felt that pain, subscribe now and follow me through every detail of this story. The room was full of color and voices. Balloons hung from the ceiling. The dessert table looked like it came out of a magazine, and children darted back and forth with their hands sticky from Brigadeiro chocolate truffles. It was my granddaughter's 5th birthday. I should have been among the guests, celebrating, but my hands weren't holding presents or champagne flutes. They held a heavy tray full of plastic cups of soda. My daughter, radiant in a new dress, passed me as if I were invisible. She made a small gesture with her hand. "Mom, take some more juice to the kids out on the porch." I obeyed. I crossed the room with slow steps, dodging children, trying to keep the tray balanced. As I served, I noticed suspicious looks. Some followed me with curiosity, others with pity. Then a man, a friend of my son-in-law's, laughed loudly and asked, so everyone could hear, "Wait, isn't that your mother?" The noise in the room seemed too dim. Several faces turned toward me. The cup I was handing almost slipped from my hand. My daughter answered quickly, laughing, but her laugh sounded forced. "Yes, she is. But here at home, everyone helps. Right, Mom?" That sentence pierced my chest like an arrow. Helps it wasn't help. It was an order. It was an obligation. I felt my face burn, my cheeks flushing with shame. I forced a smile, as I had so many times in life to hide the pain, and kept serving, pretending everything was normal. But inside, every step felt heavy. While I arranged the cups on the table, I heard a whisper behind me. "How odd, making your mother serve guests." The comment was quick, muffled, but enough to open the wound even wider. I went back to the kitchen and leaned the tray against the sink. I breathed deeply, trying to hold back tears. From the other room, I heard the chorus begin. "Happy birthday to you." I closed my eyes and let the voices echo. This should have been a night of joy, but what I felt was loneliness. Loneliness inside my own daughter's house. And a question hammered in my mind. When did I stop being a mother and become merely a maid disguised as a guest? As I listened from the kitchen to the measured clapping and the voices singing happy birthday, my thoughts slipped back to another time. A time when I baked simple cakes, sprinkled only with sugar and chocolate sprinkles. There were no lavish tables or elaborate decorations. There was me, exhausted after a day's work, and 3 hopeful children waiting for any small celebration. I remember cutting tiny slices so the cake would be enough for everyone. My daughter, the youngest, was always the first to clap. She would run to hug me, frosting smearing my arms, and say, "Mom, this is the best cake in the world." I would smile, even with aching feet and calloused hands. That sentence made any sacrifice worthwhile. Those years were like that. Double shifts, sometimes triple. I worked outside the home, took in laundry when money was tight, did sewing at night for neighbors. I stopped buying new clothes for myself, stopped fixing my own shoes, just to make sure they, my children, had the basics. Life was never generous with me, but I had a purpose, that my children wouldn't go hungry, that they would study, that they would grow up with dignity. My daughter grew up watching that. She was the one who waited up for me, even when I came home late at night. She'd sit by my side, eager to know how my day had been. I would stroke her hair and tell her, "One day you'll understand, my child, all of this is for you." She promised me she would never leave me alone, that she would always take care of me. How do those promises evaporate so quickly? I closed my eyes for a moment and felt the knot in my throat tightened. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every tear I cried in silence, all of it seemed to have become invisible now. In the living room, the applause stopped and I heard my daughter say aloud, proud of the party, "See how perfect it turned out." I organized everything, and once again the contrast opened before me. In the past, she would run to thank me even for the smallest slice of cake. Now she showed her smiles to others while I was only a shadow, carrying trays as if I had no story at all. The question struck again, sharp. How could the same daughter who used to say I was her heroine now turn me into her servant? After my husband died, silence settled over the house where I had lived my whole life. Every corner carried his absence. The empty armchair, the forgotten cup in the cabinet, the scent of his cologne that lingered in the sheets. Beyond the pain of loss, there was the weight of mounting bills. My pension barely covered medications and basic expenses. My shoulders were bent, not only from age but from the fatigue of struggling alone. It was in that fragile moment that my daughter made me an offer. "Mom, You can't stay alone in that house. It's dangerous. It's sad. Come live with me. Here you'll have company. You'll be close to your granddaughter." She held my hand firmly, her look soft, almost moved. I, so tired already, felt a relief that seemed to fall from the sky. "But, daughter, won't I be in the way?" I asked, still hesitant. "No way," she replied without a second thought. "It will be good for all of us." I believed her. For the first time in months, I felt that maybe I wasn't so alone. I remember the day I closed the door of my old house. I took only a few suitcases, clothes, my favorite books, and a photo album. I touched the walls like someone saying goodbye to a friend. Each step was heavy, but full of hope. When I arrived at my daughter's house, I was greeted with smiles. My granddaughter jumped into my lap. My son-in-law squeezed my hand with a false cordiality and said, "Now you're at home." They set up a room for me. Small, in the back, but hastily made up with a new bed. My daughter showed me the spaces with enthusiasm. The modern kitchen, the well-decorated living room, the yard full of flowers. "This will be a new phase, Mom. Here you won't have to worry about anything." Her words sounded like a promise that warmed my tired heart. That night, lying in the new bed, I heard my granddaughter's laughter echo through the house. I closed my eyes and thought, maybe this is the fresh start I needed. I didn't know that in that very moment I was stepping into the trap that would turn me from a welcomed mother into an unacknowledged maid. In the first days, I tried to convince myself everything was fine. The room was small but cozy. My granddaughter's laughter filled the house with life, and my daughter treated me with a politeness that seemed sincere. But soon the little details began to pile up. At dinner, I noticed my plate was always the last to be served. I thought it was an oversight, until the third, fourth, fifth time. Then I understood. It wasn't chance, it was habit. One evening, I sat next to my granddaughter, excited to talk with her while we ate. My daughter smiled, but then corrected me. "Mom, sit over there in the corner. It's easier to organize the table." The corner was far from conversation, almost outside the circle. I swallowed hard and obeyed, but inside me a void opened. A few days later, my daughter asked, "Mom, can you wash the dishes for me today? I'm tired." It was just a request. I agreed, of course, but the next day the request came again. Then it became routine. And soon it was no longer, "Can you wash?" but, "Mom, have you already done the dishes?" My son-in-law, always joking, reinforced the weight of the situation. Good to have an older person around. Helps with everything. Saves some money. I pretended not to hear, but each phrase was a new wound. One day the wound came from my granddaughter's innocent mouth. She came into the room smiling while I was folding clothes and said, "Grandma, Mommy said you don't work, that you just help around the house." The laundry slipped from my hands. The child was not to blame. She was repeating what she heard. I hugged her tight, hiding my tears, and simply answered, "Working is much more than earning money, my love." She laughed without understanding and ran off. I stayed there, motionless, my heart crushed. That night I lay on the narrow bed in my room and stared at the ceiling for long minutes. Every detail came back to me. The plate served last, the place in the corner of the table, the commands disguised as requests, the phrase repeated by my granddaughter. All of it formed a single certainty. I was no longer seen as a mother. It was as if, little by little, they pushed me out of the family until I was left only as an obedient shadow. And in that silence I felt, for the first time, the cold warning of conscience. In that instant, I realized something serious was beginning. That night, lying in my narrow room, sleep never came. The silence of the house was broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. And, as so often happens when the soul is wounded, my mind ran backward in time. I became the young woman I once was, full of dreams that quickly turned into responsibilities. I married young not for luxury or vanity, but in the hope of building a solid family. There was love, yes, but the hardships arrived just as quickly. A tight paycheck, bills always larger than our earnings, the arrival of children in the midst of constant sacrifice. I remember sleepless nights, rocking my newborn daughter in my arms, while tears fell before I even realized it. I was just a girl, trying to be a woman, a mother, and a warrior, all at once. My husband did what he could, but fragile health and temporary jobs made everything harder. Many mornings, bread was on the table only because I took in laundry, running from one job to the next. I was in my early 20s and already carried the weight of a lifetime on my shoulders. There was no time for parties, for vanity, for rest. My kind of vanity was seeing my children go to bed with full bellies, even if I went to sleep hungry. My daughter, the same one who now reduced me to a helper, was the engine of my persistence. I remember her small, running barefoot through the house, laughing, even when we had almost no toys. I made rag dolls out of scraps, built cardboard houses, and turned a little into a whole world for her. And every time she looked at me and said, "Mom, you're the best in the world," I believed her. It was that faith in my children's love that kept me standing, even when everything around me seemed determined to push me down. Now, lying on that cold bed, the memory of those moments felt like salt in an open wound. How can a daughter who so many times called me a heroine, who so many times held my hand and said I was her strength, now put me in the place of a maid inside her own home? I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to push the thought away. But the sentence came back like a painful echo. I never imagined she, of all people, would turn against me. The years that followed were a string of silent battles. While many neighbors dreamed of parties, new clothes, and little trips, I counted coins to pay for cooking gas and the electric bill. My husband's wages, when they came, disappeared in a few days. Most of the weight fell on me. There was a time I worked in 3 houses at once, washing and ironing clothes for families who never met my eyes. The smell of soap clung to my skin, and my hands were always covered in open sores. But when I came home and saw my daughter sleeping peacefully, her stomach full, I felt rewarded. Once I remember it, while I was invited to a birthday party for a friend from my youth. I had even chosen a simple dress I'd kept for years, waiting for an occasion. But that week, the money that could have paid for my ticket and a small gift had to go toward my daughter's school supplies. I sighed, put the dress back in the back of the closet, and went to work that day as if nothing had happened. That was the portrait of my life, letting go of my dreams to plant hers. When she wanted to learn ballet, even without resources, I found a way. I worked through entire nights, sewing neighbors' clothes to pay for the lessons. I'll never forget her smile, dancing on stage in an improvised outfit I made myself, embroidered by hand, stitch by stitch. She ran into my arms after the performance and said, "Mom, you're amazing." Those words meant more than any applause. Over time, I stopped dreaming about the perfect house I'd never own, the trips I never took, the books I wanted to read. All of that became secondary. The priority was clear: my children, my daughter. I remember looking in the mirror one night and barely recognizing myself. The wrinkles had come early. My eyes carried exhaustion, but there was still a flame in them, the flame of a mother who would give anything to see her children well. And for years I believed that effort, those sacrifices, would be remembered with gratitude. But now, lying in my daughter's house, I realized her memory had erased every one of those gestures. I sacrificed my youth to give her a future. And the future she gave me in return was to turn me into her maid. If anything sustained me on the hardest days, it was the bond I had with my daughter. Among my 3 children, she was always the closest to me. She was the only one who stayed up when I came home late, carrying bags of clothes to mend. "Mom, are you tired?" she'd ask, eyes half closed with sleep. "A little, dear. But now that I've seen you, it's gone," I'd answer, trying to smile. She would sit beside me, help me sort threads and fabric, and talk until she fell asleep, with her head resting on my arm. In those moments I remembered that my effort wasn't in vain. On Sundays, when I managed a rare moment of rest, we invented simple games, hide-and-seek in the yard, little plays with rag dolls, stories made up on the spot to make her laugh. She would hug me tight and say, "Mom, when I grow up, I'm going to take care of you the way you take care of me." Those words felt like sacred promises. I kept them in my heart and believed them the way one believes a prayer. There was a winter when the house was freezing and I had no money to buy new blankets. I shared mine with her. I barely slept, worried she might be cold, but when I woke, I found her little face serene, nestled against my chest, and I thought, if I can guarantee her peaceful sleep, I've fulfilled my role in this world. I also remember the first time she got a high fever. I spent 3 nights awake, changing cool cloths, brewing tea, begging God to strengthen her. When the fever finally broke, she looked at me with tired eyes and murmured, "You never abandon me, do you?" Never, my daughter, never. Those memories were what kept me standing. I believed a bond that strong could never be broken. But now, So many years later, hearing my daughter introduce me as help in front of others, it felt as if each of those promises had been erased from her memory. The little girl who said she would care for me had grown up, but she cared only about appearances. And the mother who was once a heroine was now treated like a burden. In that small room in my daughter's house, while sleep refused to come, I let the memories play like a film without pause. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every promise I made to myself that my children would lack nothing. I remembered the day I sold my family jewelry, the only keepsakes I had from my mother, to pay the enrollment at the private school my daughter wanted so badly. I don't regret it. I would do it all again if I had to. I also remembered when she started college. I doubled my workload, took on jobs I could barely complete, just so she could study in peace without worrying about bills. On graduation day, she hugged me in front of everyone and said, "This is all because of you, Mom. I only made it here because you never gave up on me." I cried that day, my heart overflowing. I believed that all the effort, all the pain, all the sacrifice had been worth it. But now, so many years later, it was impossible not to taste the bitterness of ingratitude. The same daughter who promised to care for me, who swore she would never abandon me, now treated me like a burden disguised as help. I closed my eyes and let the tears roll silently. I didn't want anyone to see me weak, but the pain was too great to hide. And then the question formed clearly in my mind, like a sentence that ached down to the bone. I never imagined she, of all people, would turn against me. That certainty cut through me like a knife, because it wasn't a neighbor, it wasn't a stranger, it wasn't someone from outside, it was my daughter. And that betrayal was the hardest to bear. After my husband passed, the house where I had lived for decades stopped being a home and became only a memory. Every corner carried his absence: the empty rocking chair, the drawer with his shirts still smelling of cologne, the garden he watered every morning. The silence was heavy as lead. Beyond the loneliness, there were the bills. My pension didn't cover medicine, water, electricity, food. I spent sleepless nights trying to make the numbers fit in my notebook, but they always defeated me. It was in that moment of fragility that my daughter came to me, with a sweet smile and an invitation that sounded like salvation. "Mom, you can't stay alone in that big house. It's sad, it's dangerous. Come live with me. That way you'll be close to me and to your granddaughter." She spoke with such tenderness that my eyes filled with tears. I touched her hand, hesitant. "Are you sure, dear? I don't want to get in the way of your lives." "Of course not," she answered without hesitation. "It will be good for everyone. You'll be able to rest." Those words fell on me like balm. After so much struggle, maybe it was time to finally feel cared for. On moving day, I took only the essentials: a few clothes, my favorite books, and the family photo album. When I closed the door of my old house, I ran my hand along the wall as if caressing an old friend. A part of me stayed behind, but another believed I was about to find peace. When I arrived at my daughter's house, the welcome seemed warm. My granddaughter ran to the gate shouting "Grandma," and jumped into my arms. My son-in-law greeted me with a firm handshake and said, "Now this is your home." They showed me the room prepared for me. It was small, in the back, but arranged with a new bed and light curtains. My daughter hugged me and said, smiling, "This will be a new phase, Mom. You won't have to worry about anything." That night, I lay on the new bed and heard, from afar, my granddaughter's laughter echoing through the house. I closed my eyes and thought, maybe, at last, I've found the rest I searched for all these years. Little did I know that this welcome was only the beginning of a trap. The first days in that house were wrapped in a sense of relief. My daughter kept a gentle tone, my son-in-law treated me with politeness, and my granddaughter filled the room with life by waking me each morning with tight hugs. I tried hard to believe I had made the right decision. At last, I wasn't alone anymore. At breakfast, we all sat together. My daughter offered me bread, asked if I wanted more coffee, and made a point of repeating, "Here, you don't need to worry about anything." Those words cradled me like a soft song. I started helping with chores out of habit. I washed the dishes after meals, swept the yard, folded some clothes. She would say, "You didn't need to, Mom, but since you're helping, it makes things easier for me." I smiled, happy to be useful, not realizing that her words carried the seed of something bigger. There were, however, small signs I ignored. My room was tucked away, almost like a storage space turned into a bedroom at the last minute. In the living room, They rarely called on me to give my opinion about family plans. When they spoke of trips or renovations, my presence was like wind, passing unnoticed. One night, after dinner, I noticed there were only 4 chairs arranged around the table. And me? I asked lightly. My daughter laughed. "Oh, Mom, you can sit on the bench. It's easier." I sat on the wooden bench, set apart, trying not to show the pang in my chest. Still, I smiled. I clung to good memories, to promises of care, to the idea that I had finally found shelter. But deep down, something in my heart whispered that this harmony was fragile, and sooner or later it would break. And the first crack was about to appear. As the weeks went by, the sense of welcome started to mix with something more uncomfortable. There were no open arguments, no harsh words, but small gestures that, together, outlined a strange reality. One morning, I got up early and went to make coffee. I boiled the water, as I had always done, and set the table. When my daughter came downstairs and found everything ready, she said, "Oh, Mom, that's great. Now I can get myself ready calmly." I smiled, happy to help, but the next day she didn't wake up on time, nor the day after. And soon it was understood. Breakfast was my responsibility. The same happened with the house. One day I washed the dishes, out of habit. The next, no one else touched them. Clothes began appearing folded in my room, as a silent message that they were mine to take care of. There were no fights, just an invisible script I was expected to follow. Even my personal routine began to be monitored. If I took too long in the shower, my daughter would say, jokingly, "Mom, try to save a little water, okay?" If I went to bed early, my son-in-law would comment, "See, whoever wakes up early has more energy to work during the day." Work. The word weighed on me. One afternoon, while tidying the closet, I found a note left on the kitchen table. I recognized my son-in-law's handwriting. "As long as she's here, we save on a maid." I froze, holding the paper in my hands. My heart raced, and for a moment I thought I might faint. I took a deep breath, folded the note carefully, and hid it among my clothes. It wasn't just my imagination. In their eyes, I was no longer a mother. I was free labor. In that moment, I saw the first crack in the promise of welcome. And I knew that little room in the back wasn't shelter. It was the start of my prison. As the months passed, the household routine left no doubt. I was no longer the mother being cared for, but the silent maid. It all began with occasional help, but now the chores had a time, a form, and an expectation. If I didn't wake up early to make breakfast, I'd find reproachful looks. If I delayed bringing the clothes in from the line, my daughter would say, sweet but firm, "Mom, you need to be more attentive." My son-in-law, more blunt, would throw out comments that sounded like jokes but carried poison. "When you've got someone to do everything at home, you don't need to spend money on a cleaner." My granddaughter, repeating what she heard, once ran to me and said, "Grandma, Mommy said you help because you don't work." The world seemed to collapse inside me. I smiled at her, hiding the pain, and replied, "Work is much more than earning money, my dear." She laughed, innocent, and ran off. I stayed there, eyes brimming with tears. That night, I closed the door to my room and stared at the ceiling for long minutes. The muffled sound of the TV reached me, mixed with the laughter of my daughter and son-in-law, and I, alone, understood the weight of that choice. I had believed I was being welcomed, that I would have rest, affection, company. But the truth was different. In that instant, awareness struck me with clarity. What had seemed like an act of love hid a trap, and the silence that surrounded me was no longer peace. It was the silence of someone who had fallen into an invisible prison. The days that followed were a succession of small wounds. At first, they were almost imperceptible details, but together they painted a portrait of exclusion that became impossible to ignore. One night, I sat at the table beside my granddaughter. I wanted to hear about her day at school, laugh at her stories, feel that I still had a place in that family. But my daughter, smiling with hidden firmness, said, "Mom, sit at the end. It makes it easier to organize the table." The place given to me was always the corner, always the corner. During meals, I watched conversations flow like a river to which I had no access. They spoke of plans, trips, decisions. My name never came up. I was there physically, but it was as if I were invisible. That same week, I began to notice that my plate was always the last to be served. At first, I thought it was carelessness, but when it happens night after night, it's no longer coincidence. What hurt the most, however, were the innocent words of my granddaughter, repeating what she heard at home. One day she came into my room smiling while I was folding clothes and said, "Grandma, Mommy said you don't work, that you just help around the house." The clothes slipped from my hands, my chest tightened. I smiled at the girl and hugged her, hiding my tears. "Working is much more than earning money, my love." She laughed without understanding, ran off to play, and I stayed there, alone, my heart in pieces. My son-in-law, meanwhile, made sure to reinforce the sense of burden. "It's good to have someone older in the house. At least they help with everything," he would say in a joking tone. But his smile never reached his eyes. With each phrase, each gesture, I felt my place being pushed lower. From mother, I became helper. From guest, I became servant. And one night, when I closed the door to my room and laid my head on the pillow, an uncomfortable sensation settled in me. Something serious was beginning, and I still didn't know how far it would go. At first, I insisted on believing it was just an exaggeration of my tired mind. After all, I had always helped, always served. But there was a cruel difference. Before, I helped by choice. Now it was obligation disguised as affection. One afternoon, I sat in the living room to rest a little. I picked up a book, trying to dive into a story that would bring me relief. But soon my daughter passed through and commented, without looking at me, "Mom, have you already tidied up the kitchen?" The tone wasn't a request, it was an order. I closed the book slowly, set it on my lap, and stood up. Deep down, I felt as if I were apologizing for daring to rest. As the days went by, the orders became more frequent. "Mom, wash the whites first." "Mom, make sure you've mopped the porch." "Mom, watch your granddaughter while I run some errands." Always "Mom" at the start of the sentence, but without the affection the word should carry. It was only a summons, as if calling someone to fulfill duties, and the looks weighed more than the words. If I left a glass in the sink, my daughter would sigh heavily, as if bearing a burden. If I delayed tending to my granddaughter, my son-in-law raised his eyebrow in reproach. Even small joys began to be stripped away. One Sunday, I decided to bake a cake, just as I used to when my children were little. I thought it could be a gesture of love, but when I set the dish on the table, I heard my daughter say, "Mom, you didn't need to use up the ingredients. I already had another dessert planned." The words were spoken in a cold tone, in front of everyone. The cake sat there untouched, a reminder that my place was no longer welcome. That night, lying in bed, the weight of past memories rose up. The simple cakes we once baked together, her promises to take care of me, all of it seemed to have evaporated. And the question returned, sharp, burning like fire. When did I stop being a mother and become just a maid in the very house that should have sheltered me? The things that once were only subtle discomforts began to take shape before other eyes. And perhaps that was the most painful part, realizing the humiliation no longer hid within four walls. One evening, my daughter hosted a simple dinner with some of the couple's friends. The table was set, and I helped serve, as usual. While I carried the serving dish of rice, I heard one of the guests ask, "How delicious! Who made this food?" My daughter answered without hesitation, smiling, "I prepared everything myself, with lots of love." The dish nearly slipped from my hands. I swallowed hard, forced a smile, and kept serving. No one noticed, but inside I felt as if a piece of me had broken. That same week, when I went to pick up my granddaughter from school, I found two mothers chatting at the gate. One of them, an acquaintance of my daughter's, looked me up and down and whispered, just loud enough, "That's her mother. Always helping out there, like a maid." I pretended not to hear, squeezed my granddaughter's hand, and walked in silence. But those words echoed inside me for days. At home, the details piled up. The plate always served last, the chair at the end of the table, far from the rest, the conversations from which I was excluded. And what hurt most was how naturally my daughter grew used to treating me that way, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. One afternoon, when a few neighbors came to visit, she laughed and said, "Here, everyone helps out. Even my mom, she's already part of the routine." The neighbors smiled awkwardly. One of them cast me a look of pity. I lowered my eyes and remained silent. But inside me, a silent revolt began to grow. It wasn't just the work. It wasn't only the orders. It was the loss of identity. I was no longer seen as a mother. I was a convenient shadow. That night, when I closed my bedroom door, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. And for the first time, I thought clearly, if this continues, soon no one will remember who I really am. The small wounds of each day piled up like drops, slowly filling a glass until it overflows. I no longer fooled myself. What had begun as welcome had turned into a routine of submission. One night, my son-in-law brought some colleagues over to watch a soccer game in the living room. I was preparing snacks for the table when I heard one of them ask, laughing, "And this sweet lady, who is she?" My son-in-law answered without thinking, "Oh, that's my mother-in-law, but here at home she takes care of everything." The laughter echoed, light for them, but to me it sounded like stones. The way it was said, so casually, made it clear I was the housemaid. My daughter, sitting on the couch, didn't defend me. On the contrary, she added, "Yeah, here everyone pitches in." The silence I kept was the same that accompanied me every night. I smiled, pretended it was normal, but inside I carried the weight of loneliness. The next day, while folding clothes, I once again heard my granddaughter repeat words that weren't her own. "Mommy said you don't work, that you just help." This time, I couldn't hold back the tears. I hugged her tight, kissed her forehead, and when she ran off to play, I let the tears fall in silence. That night, I closed the door to my room and sat motionless, listening to the voices and laughter coming from the living room. I was inside the house, but I no longer belonged to it. And there, in the silence of that room, a realization pierced me with force. All of this was only the beginning. Something far more serious was yet to come. With time, routine stopped being a choice and became an imposition. There was no list taped to the wall, no shouted orders, but there were invisible rules I quickly learned to follow so as not to cause discomfort. If I wanted to watch television, I had to wait until everyone was asleep. If I lingered in the shower, I got the reminder, "Mom, careful with the water bill." If I left the glass out of place, my daughter would say, in a sweet tone that masked firmness, "In this house we like to keep everything in order." I, who once taught organization and discipline, was now treated like a clumsy apprentice. Food also came with its limits. One day, I took a slice of cake in the afternoon. Later, I overheard my daughter telling her husband, "I need to manage the pantry better. Things are disappearing too fast." The words weren't said directly to me, but they hit like arrows. My room, at the back of the house, was too small to keep me inside all day, so I moved between the kitchen and laundry, finding in those chores a way to occupy my time. But deep down, I realized it was no longer collaboration. It was silent obligation. One Sunday, I set the table for lunch before anyone came down. I thought it would be seen as a gesture of love. But when my daughter entered and saw everything ready, she simply said, "Perfect, Mom. That saves me time." There was no thank you, only confirmation that this was already expected. Each day seemed to erase a little more of the line between being a mother and being a servant. And I asked myself, how far would these silent rules go? As the weeks went on, what had once been subtle gestures turned into rigid routine. My daughter no longer hid how naturally she gave me orders. "Mom, wash the whites first, then the colored ones." "Mom, don't forget to iron her uniform today." "Mom, when you're done, go ahead and start dinner." She said "Mom" the way someone calls an employee by name. There was no affection in the tone, only expectation. My son-in-law, in turn, reinforced the weight of it all with his jokes. "It's good to have a mother-in-law at home. We save on hiring a cleaner." He said it laughing, but his eyes betrayed that, for him, it wasn't a joke. I tried to convince myself I still had value, that I was being useful. But inside me, a bitter feeling began to grow, that I was nothing more than a cog fitted into their routine. Even my schedule started being policed. If I went to bed late, my daughter would say, "You need to rest early so you'll have energy tomorrow." If I sat down for a few minutes to read, my son-in-law would comment, "Enjoy it while nothing's piled up." It was as if my time no longer belonged to me. And then, one afternoon, something happened that made me understand none of this was by chance. I was tidying the bookshelf in the living room when I heard my daughter on the phone. Her voice was low, but clear enough to reach my ears. "It's working here. She helps with everything, doesn't complain. I just need to keep things under control." I froze, a book still in my hands. My heart raced. Keep things under control. That was how she referred to me. I put the book back and went to the kitchen, trying not to show that I had heard, but inside me, the wound deepened. I was no longer invited to share her life. I was part of a plan. And each day it grew clearer. I wasn't there out of love. I was there out of convenience. It was a Saturday afternoon when my daughter decided to host some neighbors for coffee. The table was set with a new tablecloth, neatly aligned cups, and pastries from the bakery. I brewed the fresh coffee myself, folded the napkins, and served each guest with the best smile I could manage. While they chatted animatedly in the living room, I kept moving around with the tray, collecting plates and refilling cups. At one point, one of the neighbors asked jokingly, "Who's the helper serving us?" Her laughter filled the room. My body froze. My daughter, without hesitation, replied, "That's my mom. But here at home, everyone helps." That word again, helps. A label used to disguise the truth. The neighbors gave awkward smiles, exchanging quick glances. One of them looked at me for a moment, and in her eyes I saw compassion. I smiled, lowered my head, and kept serving. At that moment, I realized what happened inside the house was no longer confined to its walls. The exclusion had become public. I was introduced not as a mother, but as part of the household machinery. Later, after everyone left, I sat alone in my room. The smell of coffee still clung to my clothes. I looked at my wrinkled, calloused hands, the same hands that once cradled my daughter, that supported her childhood, that paid for her education. Now, those hands were seen only as tools, and in that heavy silence, I understood. The rules that bound me were no longer invisible. They were accepted, normalized, even displayed before others. And if this was already happening at small gatherings with neighbors, what else might my daughter be capable of doing before a larger audience? That week, I decided to tidy the kitchen drawer. The silverware was mixed up, the dish towels crumpled, and I thought I could organize it all, while my daughter and son-in-law were out running errands. It was then that, pulling open the deepest drawer, a crumpled piece of paper slipped out and fell to the floor. I picked it up without thinking. It was a note scribbled hastily, my son-in-law's unmistakable handwriting. The words were short, but cutting. "As long as she's here, we save on a maid. Better to put up with it than spend money." The ground seemed to vanish beneath me. The paper shook in my hands. I braced myself on the counter, afraid I might collapse. So that was it. It wasn't about help. It wasn't about living together. To them, I was a cheap resource, a burden turned into advantage. I folded the note carefully and hid it in my apron pocket. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm inside me. I didn't want them to know I had read it. Not yet. I went back to arranging the silverware, but the mechanical motion couldn't hide what I felt inside. Each knife, each spoon, each fork I put in its place felt like a stab in my own chest. That night, I went to bed without dinner. The emptiness in my stomach didn't hurt as much as the open wound in my heart. I stared at the ceiling and realized the rules weren't just silent anymore. They were planned, calculated, and in that silence I swore to myself, one day, this truth will not remain hidden in crumpled notes. Everyone will see who they really are. The note had already been a painful blow, but part of me still tried to believe it might have been just an unfortunate comment, written in a careless moment. I wanted to believe that I needed to believe it. But life, when it decides to reveal the truth, doesn't let us keep our eyes closed for long. One rainy morning, I was left alone at home. My daughter had gone out with my son-in-law to handle things at the bank, and my granddaughter was at school. The silence was so deep it felt strange. I decided to use the time to put some laundry in the machine. When I went to get the basket from my daughter's room, I saw her phone on the bed, charging. The screen lit up with a notification. My eyes moved instinctively, and before I could stop myself, curiosity won. I tapped the screen. My heart raced when I realized it was unlocked. The messages were open. My son-in-law's name at the top. The words were clear, cruel, with no room for interpretation. "She's already getting used to the routine. Better this way. Food ready, laundry done, all without spending a dime. I told you it would be worth bringing her. A maid for free. We can't let her think she has rights here. It's our house. She should be content with the little room." My hands shook. I had to sit on the edge of the bed, the phone still in my hand. Just below, my daughter's replies, "I know. Sometimes I feel sorry, but it's better this way. At least she's not alone, and we save money." Pity. That was what my daughter felt for me. Not gratitude, not respect, not love, just pity. A wave of heat coursed through my body, followed by a coldness that froze my chest. There it was, in a few lines, exposed without shame. I wasn't a mother. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't family. I was free labor. I placed the phone carefully back where I had found it, as if it were a bomb ready to explode. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but something inside me had already changed forever. At that instant, one sentence etched itself into my heart like an invisible tattoo. From this moment on, I decided I would no longer be a hostage. After putting the phone back, I closed the door quietly and walked to the kitchen. Each step felt heavier than the last. I leaned against the sink, staring at my trembling hands. How many times had those hands cooled a fever? How many times had they sewn clothes to give dignity to my children? How many times had they prepared food so no one would go to bed hungry? Now, those same hands were treated like cheap tools, useful only to save expenses. I swallowed the urge to cry. For the first time in a long while, I didn't. There was pain. Yes, but also something new, a silent strength rising inside me. I could have exploded. I could have waited for them to come back, shouted, thrown the phone on the table, exposed the humiliation. But I didn't, because in that moment I understood. Anger would only feed their contempt. What I needed was calm. I needed to watch. I needed to keep evidence. I took an old notebook from my room's drawer and began to write. I noted the date, the time, what I had read, every word. My hand still trembled, but I kept writing until everything was recorded. I closed the notebook and hid it inside my suitcase, under my clothes. With every new offense, every imposed rule, I would have a place to record it. And one day, when the right moment came, no one could say it was my imagination. The sound of the gate key turning made me shut the notebook quickly. I heard my daughter's voice calling for her child, the light laughter, the normal routine. But inside me, nothing was normal anymore. They laughed. I wrote in silence, and deep down I already knew that silence would be my weapon. In the days that followed, my routine seemed the same as always: making breakfast, tidying the house, looking after my granddaughter. But inside me, everything had changed. Each time I looked at my daughter, I no longer saw only the little girl who once promised to take care of me. I saw the woman who, together with her husband, reduced me to a shameful role, that of a maid, disguised as a mother. Her smile no longer fooled me. When she said, "Thank you, Mom, that was perfect," I heard, behind the words, the real meaning. Keep doing it. It's your duty. My son-in-law, meanwhile, was even more transparent. His jokes became sharp knives, now that I knew the truth written in their messages. "It's great to have someone who does everything without charging, right?" he'd say, laughing loudly, in front of anyone who cared to listen. I stayed silent, not because I didn't feel anger, but because I had understood something essential. Exploding would give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. My granddaughter, innocent, kept repeating phrases that cut like daggers. "Grandma, Mommy said you don't need to worry about money, because you don't work." I smiled at her, hiding the pain, and answered only, "One day you'll understand the value of work, my love." When I returned to my room, I closed the door and opened the notebook. I wrote down every word, every gesture, every look. The pages began to fill with evidence not only against them, but also as a testimony to myself. I'm not crazy. I know what I'm living. At night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and remembered all the sleepless nights I had spent caring for my daughter when she was little, and now she treated me as a burden. It was a pain impossible to explain, a mixture of hurt, indignation, and, at the same time, a silent strength growing. And within me, the certainty echoed: I would not remain a hostage, not for long. One night, while everyone slept, I got up quietly for a glass of water. The house was wrapped in shadow, and only the dim kitchen light guided my way. As I passed the sofa, I noticed my son-in-law's phone on the side table. The screen blinked with new messages. My heart sped up. I hadn't planned to look, but after what I'd already seen, how could I ignore it? I picked up the device with trembling hands and slid the screen. It was unlocked. The conversations with my daughter were still there, unhidden. "She's already doing everything. We need to think about the next step. The sooner we resolve this, the better. Her money could be useful. We can put her in a nursing home. Easier to justify to others." I felt my body freeze. My hands went cold, my heart pounding. They weren't only talking about using me as a maid. They were planning to discard me. I kept reading, even with tears blurring my eyes. My daughter had replied, "Maybe. But we need to be careful. If anyone suspects, it'll look bad. For now, let's keep things as they are. For now." 2 words that cut deeper than any knife. I placed the phone back carefully, like handling fragile glass. I walked to my room and closed the door slowly. I sat on the bed, my whole body trembling, and opened the notebook. I wrote down every detail, every phrase, every veiled threat. That night, I understood the battle was no longer just against humiliation. It was against planned abandonment, against definitive exclusion. And as I closed the notebook, I swore in silence. They don't know it yet. But one day, every word written here will be my voice. After that night, nothing seemed the same. I looked at my daughter and son-in-law and saw not only ingratitude, but calculation. It wasn't neglect. It wasn't just convenience. It was a plan. The pain burned inside me, but I knew, if I raised my voice at that moment, I would be easily silenced. They would call my words an exaggeration. They'd say I was tired, confused, too sensitive for my age, and in the end, I'd be even more isolated. That's why I chose not to react. I chose silence, not as someone who surrenders, but as someone preparing the ground. I began watching more carefully, every gesture, every glance, every word spoken between them. And for each detail, I ran to my hidden notebook and wrote it down. Times, phrases, small situations, everything had value. In the kitchen, when my son-in-law said, "We should have done this sooner, brought her here," I wrote it down. In the living room, when my daughter muttered, "She helps, but she takes up too much space," I wrote it down. It was like piecing together a puzzle. Bit by bit, I gathered evidence of the contempt with which they treated me. At night, lying in bed with my heart still heavy, I repeated silently, "They don't know it, but I see everything. And when the time comes, they won't be able to deny it." My silence was no longer weakness. It was strategy. It was the invisible thread that would one day become the rope pulling the truth into the light. And the more they laughed, the more they mocked, the stronger I grew in silence. My notebook became my confidant. Every night, when the house quieted, I opened the yellowed pages and let my hand run across the paper. I wrote down phrases, descriptions of scenes, even the tone of their voices. Every detail was recorded precisely. "Today," he said, "I saved them money," wrote it down. "She said I take up too much space," wrote it down. "They plan a nursing home," wrote it down. Writing gave me back my strength. It was as if, by putting it on paper, I turned pain into evidence, and silence into a weapon. I also began keeping small pieces of proof. A scribbled napkin with shopping lists showing my handwriting at the bottom, a sign I had done the tasks, a note forgotten with my son-in-law's name. Even messages I overheard from afar, copied word for word. No one suspected. To them, I was still the docile mother, the discreet presence that kept the house running. But inside me, something was changing. I no longer saw myself as a victim, but as a witness. I watched their performance of indifference and prepared myself for the day I would turn the audience against the leading actors. Sometimes my granddaughter came to play in my room. I smiled, quickly hid the notebook, and told her it was just a diary. She believed me, laughed, and ran back to the yard. And I asked myself, when she grows up, what memory will she have of me? The grandmother who served in silence, or the woman who one day raised her voice? The silence was heavy, but at the same time it made me stronger. It was like an invisible fabric I was stitching, thread by thread, until it became impossible to tear. And with each page I wrote, I repeated to myself, "They laugh today, but one day, each laugh will return to them, in absolute silence, when the truth comes out." Over time, I realized I didn't need only to observe, I could act even if subtly, almost imperceptibly. I began to drop little phrases, seemingly innocent, but loaded with meaning. One night, while I washed the dishes, my daughter said absent-mindedly, "Mom, you've been doing a lot. I don't know how you manage everything." I looked at her and replied calmly, "Experience teaches, and I've always learned to keep the right things, to use them at the right moment." She smiled, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. I saw doubt flicker. Another day, my son-in-law grumbled about the bills. "Money is never enough. Good thing we have this extra help." I raised my eyes, drying my hands on the dish towel, and said softly, "Help is never free. It always leaves marks." He stared at me for a few seconds, unsettled, before laughing it off. But I knew the phrase had stayed. Little by little, I planted seeds, never accusatory, never explosive, just small truths hidden inside cryptic lines. In front of guests, I kept a firm posture, no exaggerated smiles, no submission, only the serene silence of someone who knows more than she shows. And soon, I noticed it worked. The whispers between my daughter and her husband became more frequent. Sometimes, when she caught me writing in the notebook, she would ask, "What are you always jotting down?" I answered calmly, "Just memories." But one day, who knows, it might all make sense. Silence returned, but their eyes no longer carried the same certainty. And inside me, a conviction grew. They were beginning to feel the weight of a threat they couldn't yet understand. The hidden notebook was no longer just a record. It was my shield. Each line gave me strength. Each phrase stored became like an invisible weapon, waiting for the right time. I walked through the house in silence, but inside I felt I was no longer a hostage. They believed I was still the same docile, submissive, willing to carry the weight of all the chores, but they didn't see that behind each restrained smile, there was strategy. Sometimes, I looked at myself in the mirror before bed and barely recognized the woman with gray hair and tired eyes. But deep down, I also saw another version of me. The one who had learned to endure in silence, but who now knew how to use silence as a weapon. It was on one of those nights, when the couple's laughter echoed from the living room, that I made my decision. I would not explode. I would not waste myself in arguments that would make me look hysterical. I would choose a gesture. Small, almost imperceptible, but one that would plant doubt, that would crack the facade they showed the world. I closed the notebook, tucked it under the clothes in my suitcase, and before turning off the light, I whispered to myself, "Soon, I'll take the first step. And when that happens, nothing will ever be the same." I fell asleep with my heart racing not from pain, but from the anticipation of what was to come. The day of the small gesture arrived without anyone suspecting. It was a Sunday lunch, one of those gatherings where some relatives came to visit. My daughter worked hard to show perfection: a neatly set table, lace tablecloth, aligned plates, a wide smile for the guests. I, as always, moved between the kitchen and dining room, carrying dishes, pouring drinks, almost invisible. But that day, I decided I wouldn't just be the silent shadow. While helping to serve, one of the cousins said cheerfully, "What a beautiful home, cousin. You organize everything with such care." My daughter smiled, satisfied, and replied, "Oh yes, I manage well. Here at home, everyone does their part." At that moment, I looked at the cousin and said, in a calm, almost sweet voice, "That's true. Just don't forget that sometimes the biggest share falls on the ones you least expect." The silence that followed was brief, but heavy. The cousin looked at me curiously, then turned to my daughter, who, embarrassed, gave a nervous laugh. "Oh, my mother loves to exaggerate," she said, trying to cover it up. But the seed had already been planted. Later, while clearing the plates, I noticed discreet whispers in the living room. Relatives exchanged glances, some frowning, others murmuring to each other. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew they were questioning. For the first time in a long while, I felt a slight triumph. It wasn't open revenge. It was just a simple, calculated gesture, leaving behind a trail of doubt. And when I saw my daughter avoid my eyes for the rest of the lunch, I knew for certain that this was only the first of many steps. That week, I noticed something had changed. The words I had dropped at Sunday lunch hadn't died at the table. They echoed, traveled from mouth to mouth, taking on new forms. At the bakery, I ran into an old neighbor who said, "Curious, I heard you're living with your daughter now. But tell me, is it true that you're the one taking care of everything there?" I smiled without answering right away. I just looked into her eyes and said, "Every house has its truth. Some truths, one day, come to light." She blinked, surprised by my answer, and didn't press further. But I knew that doubt had already been planted. The next day, during a visit from a distant aunt, I overheard a whisper from the living room while I was tidying the kitchen. "Have you noticed how she's always serving? She looks more like staff than a guest." My hands froze on the plate I was washing. I closed my eyes for a moment and felt a mix of pain and relief. Pain at seeing my condition exposed. Relief at realizing I was no longer the only one who noticed. My daughter, increasingly uneasy, began to change her tone with me. Her requests, once disguised as kindness, now came with rushed justifications. "Mom, can you tidy the living room? I've got so much to do." "Mom, watch your granddaughter for a bit. I really can't handle it alone." She no longer said, "You're helping." Now she tried to defend herself before I could say anything. My son-in-law, on the other hand, looked at me with suspicion. I noticed his narrowed eyes when, in the middle of a visit, I deliberately sat at the table with everyone instead of waiting to be sent to the corner. I didn't say a word, I just smiled. But deep down, I knew my presence was no longer just a shadow. It was discomfort, it was threat, and that was exactly what I wanted. The second gesture came at another family lunch, one with more relatives than usual. My daughter, as always, insisted on displaying perfection, carefully decorated dishes, a new tablecloth, her rehearsed smile for every visitor. I moved through the kitchen, silently fulfilling my role. Then one of the nephews said loudly, so everyone could hear, "Aunt, this food is delicious. You really know how to host." My daughter opened a wide smile and proudly replied, "Thank you. I make sure to take care of every detail." The comment cut through me like a knife, but this time, I didn't stay silent. I set the serving dish calmly on the table, wiped my hands on the cloth, and looking directly at the nephew, I said, "It's true, my dear. Everything looks perfect. But you know, no beautiful table stands without invisible hands holding it up." The silence was immediate. Some laughed, finding the metaphor amusing. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. My daughter, pale, tried to laugh and changed the subject. "Oh, my mother loves those enigmatic phrases. Don't mind her." But I noticed in the eyes of the guests that doubt was spreading once again. And more importantly, I noticed in my daughter's and son-in-law's eyes that they were unsettled. The confidence they displayed was beginning to crumble. Later, when everyone had left, my daughter entered my room without knocking. "Mom, why did you say that in front of everyone?" she asked, trying to sound calm, but her voice trembled. I closed the book I was pretending to read and answered simply, "Because sometimes, daughter, it's necessary to remind people that nothing stays hidden forever." She said nothing, she just stared at me, her eyes full of uncertainty, before leaving and slamming the door. And in that instant I knew the first crack was turning into a fissure. And soon the entire wall would come down. It wasn't just the silent walls anymore. It was the looks. My daughter avoided meeting my eyes. My son-in-law, restless, paced the living room without his usual confidence. Even my granddaughter noticed the strange atmosphere and asked innocently, "Mommy, why is Grandma sad?" My daughter hurried to change the subject, but I saw it. I saw the shadow of fear in her eyes, fear of what I might say, fear of what I might reveal. Before retreating to my room, I passed through the living room and dropped a short phrase, almost as if speaking to myself. "The truth is patient. It waits for the right moment to appear." I didn't need to say anything else. The silence that followed was louder than any speech. In my room, I sat on the bed and smiled for the first time in a long while. It wasn't a smile of revenge, but of certainty. I was no longer invisible. They knew it, and for the first time, it was they who felt cornered. I closed the notebook, turned off the light, and lay down. My heart, still racing, repeated the phrase that carried me into sleep. "They've begun to feel fear," and that was only the beginning. It didn't take long for the first voices to rise outside the house. What had begun as a timid whisper at Sunday lunch now spread through the neighborhood corners, quick conversations at the market, even in the bakery line. One day, while buying bread, I overheard two neighbors whispering near the counter, "Have you noticed she's always at her daughter's house, serving and doing everything? Yeah, it doesn't seem right. That lady should be resting, not turning into a maid." I pretended not to hear, but inside, a flame lit. For the first time, it wasn't just me who saw it. Others were beginning to notice the farce. At my granddaughter's school, another moment marked me. One of the mothers greeted me and, in an almost sympathetic tone, said, "You must be very dedicated. They say you're the one keeping the house running." I smiled politely, but replied calmly, "Dedication is no problem, my dear. The problem is when they confuse dedication with servitude." She looked at me, surprised, unsure how to respond, but I could tell the message stayed. At home, my daughter seemed more nervous. Where once she paraded her smile of the perfect housewife, now she no longer tried as hard. She noticed every whisper, every sideways glance, and it unsettled her. My son-in-law tried to brush it off with irony. "People love to make up stories, huh? They see one little thing and already start spreading it around." But I knew these weren't inventions. It was the truth knocking at the door, asking to come in. And inside me, certainty grew. The more people talked, the more their mask would fall. The voices in the community, once timid whispers, began turning into more open conversations. It was impossible to control. At Sunday Mass, I heard two women behind me whisper, "Poor mother. I always see her carrying bags, while the daughter arrives empty-handed." Yeah, they say the daughter treats her more like an employee than a mother. My chest tightened, but this time not with pain. It felt as if, finally, someone saw what I had been screaming inside all along. As we left the church, a neighbor discreetly approached me. "Madam, forgive my boldness, but if you need help, you can count on me. I know things aren't easy in there." I thanked him with a contained smile, without revealing anything. But my heart warmed. I wasn't so alone anymore. Meanwhile, my daughter began to feel the effects. Visits, once constant, grew rare. Friends who used to shower her with compliments now kept a careful distance. One afternoon, I heard one of them at the gate say quietly, "It's hard to defend you, you know. The whole neighborhood is talking." My daughter tried to laugh, but her voice shook. People love to invent things, you know how it is. But her eyes betrayed her fear. My son-in-law reacted with anger. Slamming the car door one night, he said, "People are talking too much about us. You need to control your mother." Control your mother. The words hit me like a slap, but also like fuel. They were no longer comfortable. They no longer laughed with the same confidence. And I, in silence, knew, the more they tried to hide, the more the truth would come out. It didn't take long for the comments to leave the neighborhood and reach more distant relatives. The voices once whispered on the corners now echoed at family gatherings. One afternoon, my older sister showed up unannounced. She entered with a serious face and hugged me tightly. "Is what they're saying true, my sister?" she asked, her eyes brimming. I looked at her and simply answered, "Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be spoken by me. People see it on their own." She sighed, lowered her head, and as she let me go, she shot a hard look at my daughter, who was sitting in the living room. The atmosphere grew heavy. Days later, during a nephew's birthday, I overheard one aunt whispering to another, "She was always so dedicated. She doesn't deserve this treatment." Yeah, but her daughter always was bossy. Now it's gone too far. My daughter pretended not to hear, but I saw the flush rise in her cheeks. My son-in-law clenched his fists under the table, his anger plain. Little by little, I realized I no longer needed to defend myself. The looks, the conversations, the judgments were being made by others. I just stayed silent, letting each word spoken by the community fall on them like an inevitable weight. And the more they tried to maintain the perfect image, the more their facade crumbled. My daughter smiled at visitors, but her eyes betrayed insecurity. My son-in-law, once always sarcastic, now grew sharp, answering even simple questions with irritation. It was like watching a mask crack before an attentive audience, and I, in my corner, only observed. I knew the fall was still to come and it would be public. Time passed, and the whispers turned into open comments. What had once been said in secret was now spoken right in front of them. At the market, a woman looked at me and said without shame, "Stay strong, dear. It's not fair for a mother to be treated like this." My daughter, standing beside me, turned pale. She pretended not to hear, but I saw her hands tremble as she picked up the grocery bag. Another time, at a family gathering, a younger cousin asked loudly, in front of everyone, "But why is it always your mother who serves and cleans up? Shouldn't she be resting?" The silence was suffocating. My daughter tried to laugh, but the sound was false. My son-in-law rushed to change the subject, but it was too late. The suspicious glances had already spread across the table. That night, when I went to bed, I carried with me a strange feeling. It wasn't relief, it wasn't victory. It was simply the certainty that the wall of appearances my daughter and son-in-law had built was collapsing before everyone's eyes. But at the same time, something inside me warned, if they felt too cornered, they might react even more cruelly. I closed the notebook, hid it under my clothes, and took a deep breath. The voices of the community were like hammers pounding on the perfect facade they tried to maintain. And I knew, each strike brought the moment of collapse closer. I lay down on that narrow bed and, before closing my eyes, felt a chill run down my spine. The mask was beginning to crack, but the worst was yet to come. The voices in the community had already begun to corrode the perfect image of my daughter and son-in-law. But I knew, gossip alone wasn't enough. If I wanted to reveal the truth, I would need something concrete, something impossible to deny. And that proof appeared when I least expected it. It was an ordinary afternoon. My daughter had gone out to take my granddaughter to a birthday party, and my son-in-law was at work. The house was quiet, and I decided to organize the stack of papers in the living room drawer. There, among old bills and forgotten flyers, I found a brown envelope, poorly sealed. At first, I thought it was just another bill, but when I opened it, my heart nearly stopped. There were copies of documents and notes written by hand. I recognized my son-in-law's handwriting. Check possibility of transferring pension, research vacancies in long-term care, institutions, justify to relatives, mother can no longer take care of herself. My hands trembled as I read. Each line was a stab. They weren't just talking about me as a burden. They were planning my future in silence, and that future was abandonment. Among the papers, there was even a printed price list for a nursing home. The sheet listed costs, packages, conditions of payment. The name of the institution sat there, in cold, impersonal letters. For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. I held onto the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. My tear-filled eyes ran across those lines, and an overwhelming certainty took hold of me. They didn't just see me as free labor. They wanted to get rid of me once and for all. I closed the envelope and carried it to my room. I hid it with my notebook, under my clothes, as if it were a dark treasure. In that moment, I realized this was no longer just about enduring. It was about survival. And a phrase echoed inside me, like a calling. At that moment, I knew. My time was coming. I spent that night wide awake, lying still. I heard the muffled laughter of the television in the living room, and the distant sound of my daughter's bedroom door closing. But inside me, there was only cutting silence. The envelope lay hidden under my clothes, pulsing like a bomb ready to explode. Each word written on it replayed in my mind in waves. Transfer pension, long-term care institution, justify to relatives. Tears came, but they weren't of weakness. They were tears of mourning, mourning for a daughter I no longer recognized. I closed my eyes and went back in time. I saw the little girl who once ran barefoot to me, saying she would never leave me alone. I saw the young woman graduating from college while my calloused hands clapped in the audience. I saw the woman who promised to care for me when I became a widow. Where was she now? All that remained was a stranger, capable of betraying me with the coldness of someone I had never known. But amidst the pain, something began to grow inside me, a different strength, silent, but keeping me upright. I wouldn't fight with screams. I wouldn't reveal the truth with rushed accusations. I would have patience. I would guard every piece of evidence, and when the time was right, I would present it all before whoever needed to see it so that no one could ever doubt me. I rose before dawn, washed my face, and looked into the mirror. My eyes were red, but in them burned a flame I hadn't seen in a long time. You want to erase me, I whispered to my own reflection. But you don't yet know the strength of a woman who has resisted her whole life. I went back to my room, took the notebook, and wrote down every detail of what I had found. The pages were no longer just records, they were witnesses. And when I finished writing, I closed the notebook firmly and took a deep breath. The pain was immense, but even greater was the certainty that I was no longer just surviving. I was waiting for the moment when all the lies would collapse before everyone. In the days that followed, life in the house seemed the same. My daughter gave me orders disguised as requests. My son-in-law cracked cruel jokes. I went on serving, caring, cleaning, but inside, nothing was the same anymore. Every gesture I made was now accompanied by a silent thought. You have no idea what I know. In the kitchen, as I chopped vegetables, I watched my daughter on the phone. She smiled, pretended sweetness, but I remembered the cold notes in the envelope. Justified to relatives. She was already rehearsing speeches for the day she would discard me. In the yard, hearing my son-in-law say to a friend, "Life's a lot easier when you've got someone who does everything without charging." I just took a deep breath, repeating silently, "One day, your own words will be your ruin." At night, when everyone slept, I opened the notebook and made quiet plans, not only recording what happened, but starting to organize how it would all be revealed. I knew it couldn't be in secret. If it was just me against them, they'd easily call me crazy or ungrateful. It had to be before an audience. It had to be at the right moment, in the right place, with witnesses who could never deny the truth. I began imagining possibilities: a family lunch, a celebration, even my granddaughter's birthday party. Any occasion where everyone would be present, feeling safe and carefree. And then, when they least expected it, the farce would collapse. That simple thought gave me strength. It wasn't bitter revenge, it was justice, it was dignity. And as I turned off the light that night, I murmured to myself, "You've chosen the path of lies. I've chosen the path of patience, and in the end, patience always wins." One sleepless night, I got up quietly. I opened the closet and pulled out the hidden envelope. I sat on the edge of the bed, heart racing, and began rereading each sheet, each note, until, tucked at the bottom of the envelope, I noticed a detail I had missed before. There was a small bank slip, a large withdrawal, made recently. In the corner, a rushed note in my daughter's handwriting. First part resolved, remaining after transfer. My whole body shook. It wasn't just future plans, they had already begun to act. My pension, that small amount, my only means of survival, was already in their sights, and from what that slip showed, part of it had already been touched. My breathing grew shallow. I held the slip tightly between my fingers, feeling the weight of the betrayal grow heavier still. It wasn't just a threat, it was reality. I closed my eyes for a moment and forced myself to breathe deeply. If before I only wanted proof, now I had something far more powerful, concrete evidence that they had already laid their hands on what was mine. I tucked the paper back into the envelope, hid everything under my clothes, and closed the drawer. I lay down again, but sleep never came. My heart pounded, and a phrase echoed inside me: "The hour is coming, and when it does, no one will be able to deny what you've done." The day of the confrontation arrived without warning. It was a family lunch, planned by my daughter to celebrate my son-in-law's birthday. The house was full of relatives, close friends, and curious neighbors. The tables were decorated, the food abundant, and my daughter smiled her rehearsed smile, the same one she always wore when she wanted to display perfection. I, as usual, moved between the kitchen and the living room, serving plates, filling glasses, clearing dishes. For the guests, it was just another ordinary scene. But inside, every gesture was accompanied by a thought. "Today, you will hear me." As I passed with a pitcher of juice, I heard my daughter raise her voice louder than usual. She laughed, surrounded by guests, and pointed at me. "My mother is such a blessing in this house. She does everything, takes care of everything. I honestly don't know how we'd live without her." The phrase, spoken as praise, carried venom. The guests laughed, some clapped, others just smiled awkwardly. But I also noticed glances of pity, glances that spoke more than words. I swallowed hard but stayed firm. The party went on, and every minute I felt the humiliation repeat itself in small gestures. My daughter calling me to fetch something from the kitchen, my son-in-law asking me to clear the table, muffled laughter as I passed by. Until, at one point, one of the younger nephews asked out loud, "But, isn't she your mother?" For an instant, silence fell. My daughter laughed nervously and replied quickly, "Of course she is. But she likes to help here, don't you, Mom?" Everyone looked at me. The weight of expectation fell on my shoulders, and it was at that moment I felt the hour was beginning to draw near. My daughter's nervous laugh still echoed in the room as all eyes turned to me. Some waited for me to confirm her words, others looked away, embarrassed. I took a deep breath and smiled serenely. "Yes, I've always helped, ever since she was little. It wouldn't be different now." There was a quick murmur. Relieved. My daughter laughed again, as if she had won the moment. But inside, I knew, that smile was proof she still believed she had control. The afternoon went on. Between one dish and the next, she kept showing me off, as if I were a trophy on display. "Look at her. My mother never stops. If it weren't for her, nothing here would work." My son-in-law chimed in, laughing loudly. "True. And the best part is, she doesn't charge a cent." The laughter spread, and in that instant, I felt the words cut deeper than any knife. My hand gripped the tray so tightly I thought it might snap, but I held back. It wasn't time to react, not yet. I returned to the kitchen, set the tray on the counter, and leaned against the sink for a few seconds. I looked at my wrinkled hands, marked by time, and took a deep breath. They think they own me, but they don't know what I'm holding. I dried my hands on the dish towel and walked back to the living room. Every step was calculated, every glance measured. The humiliation continued, but I no longer felt it the same way. Now, every phrase was another brick they themselves were stacking on the wall that would one day fall on their heads. And when one of the guests whispered quietly to another, "This doesn't seem right," I knew I wasn't alone in that room. My heart raced. The moment was drawing near. The room was full of forced laughter, broken conversations, and plates being passed around. But behind the facade of joy, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I could feel the guests' eyes on me, sometimes pitying, sometimes curious. My daughter, increasingly confident, kept showing me off. If my mother weren't here, I don't know what I'd do. She likes to help. After all, she's used to it, she said, laughing, as if it were a joke. My son-in-law raised his glass and added, "Let's toast to that, to the best maid anyone could have without paying a dime." His laugh echoed through the room. Some guests laughed politely, but others just exchanged uneasy glances. The comment hadn't landed well. I saw it in their eyes. My fingers trembled as I held the glass of juice in my hand. But instead of spilling tears or answering explosively, I remained steady. I set the glass down on the table, straightened my back, and let silence work for me. An older cousin, sitting nearby, whispered to the aunt beside her, "That's no way to talk about your own mother." Those words reached my ears like balm. I wasn't alone. Their mask was already starting to crack in front of the audience. I went back to the kitchen for a moment, leaned against the counter, and breathed deeply. The envelope and notebook were hidden in my room, waiting for the right moment. And I knew that moment was close. I closed my eyes and thought, it won't be in shouting. It won't be in anger. It will be at the exact time, in front of everyone. When I returned to the living room, I walked slowly, observing each face, and that's when I noticed the discomfort wasn't only mine. It was etched on the guests' expressions, who could no longer hide their indignation. My heart beat faster. I had just decided it would be that day. Dinner went on, but the heaviness in the air was impossible to ignore. The laughter sounded forced. The conversations broke into awkward silences, and every comment from my daughter or son-in-law bothered the guests more and more. Standing, serving another dish, I heard my daughter raise her voice again. "I don't know what I'd do without my mother. She likes to help, doesn't she? After all, she's already used to it." The laughter that followed thundered inside me. But this time, I didn't lower my eyes. I placed the dish on the table slowly, wiped my hands on the cloth, and stood tall, facing the group. Silence spread quickly. One by one, eyes turned toward me, as if everyone was waiting for my answer. I took a deep breath. Inside, my heart pounded. Outside, my voice came calm, but firm. They can laugh. They can say what they want. But the truth always finds its way. The room plunged into silence. Even my granddaughter, who was playing with a doll in the corner, stopped to look. My daughter laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. "Oh, you know my mother, always with her dramatic lines. Don't mind her, she..." But her voice faltered. She realized, everyone realized, and it was in that instant that I made my decision. I looked at the table, then at the guests, and said, "Today you will hear something you never imagined." The air hung suspended. Conversations died. All eyes were on me, and deep inside my chest, a certainty took root. The moment had arrived. The room was drowned in silence. The guests, who seconds earlier were laughing and chatting, now stared at me with expectation, as if they sensed something important was about to happen. My daughter, still standing, tried to regain control. "Mom, please, don't make a scene in front of everyone. Sit down, let's continue dinner." But I didn't move. I looked at each face at the table, one by one, until my eyes locked with hers. She looked away. "You think I'm here only to serve?" I began, my voice steady, not trembling. "But the truth is, there's much more happening in this house than you could ever imagine." Some guests exchanged uneasy glances. My son-in-law forced a laugh. "Oh, let's not start with wild stories, okay?" I didn't answer. I walked to my room with firm steps and returned minutes later carrying the notebook and the envelope. I placed them on the table, in front of everyone, as if laying down a sentence. The murmuring was immediate. My daughter turned pale. "Mom, what is this?" she asked, her voice cracking. I held the notebook to my chest and said, "These are my words, and inside here is everything I've seen, heard, and written down over these months. But that's not all." I raised the envelope. "Here are the papers you yourselves left scattered, receipts, plans, budgets, all written in your own hands." The guests looked at each other in shock. Some leaned closer to see, others were already muttering indignant words. Before my daughter could speak, I added, "Today, you'll learn who I truly was in this house, and what they planned to do with me." The silence was absolute. I gripped the envelope tightly, feeling all eyes fixed on me. My daughter stepped forward, trying to grab the papers. "Mom, don't do this. We'll talk later, in private." I pushed her hand away calmly, but firmly. "No, daughter. There's been silence long enough. Today, everyone will hear." I opened the envelope and pulled out the first sheet. My voice rang clear, cutting through the heavy air of the room. "Verify possibility of transferring pension." The guests murmured. Some widened their eyes, others covered their mouths with their hands. My son-in-law tried to laugh. "That's nonsense. Just scribbles. It means nothing." I didn't give him time. I picked up another sheet and read, "Research vacancies in long-term care institutions." The impact was immediate. An aunt stood abruptly, indignant. "That's a nursing home. Were you really planning to lock your own mother away?" My daughter paled, trying to justify. "It's not like that. It was just an idea, nothing serious." But I continued, steady. "Explain to relatives. Mother can no longer take care of herself." Voices rose in outrage. Some guests shook their heads in reproach. Others whispered to each other, scandalized. It was as if their facade was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Finally, I lifted the last paper, the bank receipt, and said, "And here's the proof. It wasn't just plans. They've already started touching my money." The room erupted in murmurs, faces of shock, anger, disbelief. My daughter trembled. My son-in-law clenched his fists, and I, heart racing, realized the truth was no longer mine alone. Now it was out in the open. The whispers grew, spreading through the room like waves. Some relatives shook their heads in disapproval. Others looked at me with compassion, while many fixed openly accusatory eyes on my daughter and her husband. The son-in-law snapped. He stood abruptly, slamming his hand on the table. "This is absurd. These papers mean nothing. You're twisting everything to play the victim." Silence returned for a moment, but not in support of him. It was the silence of shock, the heavy silence of those watching a mask break apart. I drew a deep breath, unshaken. I opened the notebook in my hands and read an entry I had written months earlier. "Today," he said, "it's good to have someone who takes care of everything without charging a dime." They laughed together. Noted at 9:15 p.m. I looked at the guests. I wrote down every word, every humiliation, every plan. I'm not the one twisting the truth. They're the ones who've been trying to hide it. The murmurs rose again, louder this time, accompanied by accusing stares aimed at my daughter and son-in-law. My daughter, flustered, tried to laugh it off. "Come on, you know how my mother is. Exaggerated, dramatic. She's always been like that." But her voice wavered, trembling. No one seemed convinced. They no longer saw a dramatic mother. They saw an elderly woman, used, humiliated, and betrayed in her own home. I straightened my posture and concluded, "Call me dramatic. Call me whatever you want. But here, in front of everyone, the truth has been spoken. And truth has a weight no lie can carry." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't awkwardness. It was the silence of an entire room recognizing the fall of a mask. The room remained frozen, as if time itself had stopped. The notebook lay open on the table, the papers spread out under the watchful eyes. The weight of that evidence left no room for excuses. A cousin stood up, furious. "This is monstrous. How could you?" An aunt, who had always defended my daughter, now shook her head in denial. "I can't believe this. Sending your own mother away, stealing her money." My son-in-law tried to argue, but his voice came out weak, drowned by the whispers that turned into harsh phrases. "What a disgrace. Ingratitude is unforgivable. Their own mother." My daughter trembled, not knowing where to look. Her eyes filled with tears, her mouth half open, but no words came out. She, who always had an answer for everything, was now silent, and I, standing firm, simply took a deep breath. There was no anger in my tone when I spoke, only the clarity of someone whose voice was finally heard. "For too long, they treated me like a shadow in this house, but today, you all saw the truth. I don't need to prove anything else." The words echoed in the room like a seal. The absolute silence that followed was louder than any scream. And in that instant, I realized, the turning point was complete. Their perfect image had collapsed before everyone. And from that day forward, nothing would ever be the same. The eyes in the room were no longer my enemies. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't the one being judged. They were. My daughter, still standing, searched for words, but the trembling of her lips betrayed her. My son-in-law, red with anger, tried to maintain his composure, but the whispers grew louder by the second. How could you do this? One of the aunts asked, her voice breaking with indignation. You planned to destroy your own mother for money. My daughter tried to respond, but her voice faltered. It's not like that. You don't understand. But no one believed her anymore. The weight of the truth sat squarely on her shoulders, and each look of reproach was like a stone hurled at the perfect image she had always tried to build. My son-in-law, out of patience, exploded. And you believe her? An old, bitter woman with a notebook full of crazy scribbles. A heavy silence fell, but it was broken when one of the nephews stood and said loudly, "Those aren't just scribbles. I saw the papers. They're right here, in front of everyone. This isn't made up." The guests murmured in agreement. Cornered, the son-in-law fell back into his chair, defeated by his own outburst. My daughter cried silently, eyes cast down, unable to meet anyone's gaze, and I, steady, simply watched. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to humiliate. They were being destroyed by the weight of their own actions. The whispers turned into open voices. No one held back anymore. "This is inhumane," said one cousin, glaring at my daughter. "You took advantage of her kindness," added an uncle, arms crossed. My daughter, face wet with tears, raised her hands in a plea. "Please, listen. It's not what it looks like. We only wanted the best for her. We never meant to hurt her." But the words rang hollow, fragile, unable to support the lie. A neighbor who had been invited to the dinner murmured loudly enough for everyone to hear, "If it were really the best, you wouldn't have planned to hide her away in a nursing home. That's betrayal." The eyes turned back to my daughter. She trembled. She sought support from her husband, but he, visibly irritated, stayed silent, unable to respond. Then an aunt, always known for being discreet, raised her voice like never before. "I watched you, girl, growing in your mother's arms. I saw everything she did for you. And now, this is how you repay her." My daughter collapsed to her knees, sobbing in front of everyone. I was lost. I didn't know what else to do. But no one was moved. Her words carried no sincere remorse, only despair at being exposed. My son-in-law, trying to regain control, stood again and spoke harshly. "You don't understand. It was the only possible solution. She's a burden." The impact was devastating. The guests reacted with a mix of indignation and disgust. Someone shouted, "A burden? This woman gave her life for you." And in that instant, I realized, their humiliation no longer needed my voice. It was the chorus of the community condemning them. My daughter remained on her knees, her face hidden in her hands. Tears streamed uncontrollably, but I couldn't see sincerity in them, and neither could the others. "Forgive me. I wasn't thinking straight. I was overwhelmed," she murmured, her voice breaking. A cousin crossed her arms and answered coldly, "Overwhelmed, with your own mother helping you with everything. There's no excuse." Another added, "Forgiveness isn't asked for with tears alone. It's proven with actions. And your actions showed the opposite." My daughter lifted her face, eyes red and pleading, looking at me. "Mom, please, say something, defend me." But I remained silent, not out of cruelty, but because I knew that was no longer my role. They needed to hear from everyone else what they had always tried to deny. My son-in-law, impatient, yanked his wife by the arm, trying to lift her. "Enough of this. They don't understand anything," he shouted, his voice dripping with rage. But the crowd was already against them. No one saw them as victims of circumstance anymore, but as oppressors in disguise. One of the nephews, outraged, raised his voice. "You've disgraced the family. You tried to strip her even of her right to live with dignity. That can't be erased." My daughter sobbed, her body trembling, too weak to respond. My son-in-law, on the other hand, clenched his fists, unable to accept defeat. And I, in the middle of that scene, felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I hadn't needed to raise my voice. Justice was being done in front of everyone. The atmosphere was heavy, as if every word spoken carried the weight of a sentence. My daughter, still on her knees, sobbed in despair. But no one moved to console her. The silence of the family was the cruelest judgment she could ever receive. "I just wanted peace. I didn't know what else to do," she insisted, her voice breaking. But people looked away, cold, as if they no longer believed a word. It was the same indifference she had so often shown me when I needed her. My son-in-law drained, sank into his chair, defeated, his trembling hands, his face twisted with restrained rage, but unable to lift his head under the weight of collective reproach. My daughter, for the first time, tasted what it meant not to be heard. The eyes that once admired her now avoided her. The mouths that once praised her now whispered her name with reproach, and I, in silence, simply watched. There was no joy in seeing her like this. It was bitter, painful, but necessary. She had built that fate herself, brick by brick, with every act of ingratitude, every gesture of contempt, every word that reduced me to invisibility. That night, before everyone, my daughter tasted the bitter fruit of her own indifference, and I knew nothing would ever be the same again. After that night, the house was no longer the same. The false laughter ceased, the voices diminished, and the silence that lingered within those walls was no longer one of submission. It was the silence of the weight of truth. My daughter could barely look me in the eye. My son-in-law spent his days locked inside his own wounded pride, and I, for the first time in a long while, walked through those rooms without feeling like a shadow. But I knew my place was no longer there. That house, which should have been a refuge, had turned into a prison, and now that the chains had been broken, there was no reason to remain. One morning, I calmly packed my clothes. I folded each piece, tucked away the notebook and the envelope, not as weapons, but as reminders of the path I had walked. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Everyone had seen. Everyone knew. Before closing the suitcase, I sat on the edge of the bed and took a deep breath. There was no resentment, only a strange serenity. I no longer desired revenge. What I wanted was freedom. My daughter appeared at the doorway, her eyes red, her voice low. "Mom, are you leaving?" I lifted my head, steady, and replied, "I'm not leaving, daughter. I'm going in peace. I stopped having a place here a long time ago. Now I need to find myself again," she cried, but didn't try to stop me. Perhaps she knew it was already too late. I closed the suitcase, lifted it with firm hands, and as I crossed the doorway, I felt as though a new life was beginning to unfold before me. Carrying the suitcase, I crossed the street with steady steps. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel lost. It was as if each step was a piece of freedom regained. When she saw me with the suitcase in my hands, a neighbor hurried over. "Is everything all right?" she asked, concerned. I smiled gently. "Now it is. I'm just following my path." She hugged me tightly, and her tearful eyes reminded me that I was not alone. In the days that followed, others came closer. Old friends offered me support, some even a place to stay for a while. One of them, Donna Celeste, opened her door without hesitation. "You'll always have a room here, my dear. No need to thank me. Life has already taken too much from you. Now it's time to rest." I accepted with gratitude. Her house was simple, but filled with warmth. There, no one saw me as a burden or a servant. I was a guest, a companion, a friend. In the community, the eyes that once passed over me with indifference now carried respect. People greeted me, some even praised my courage. "You were strong. You didn't stay silent in the face of injustice," a neighbor told me. Those words fell on me like bomb. I, who had so often felt invisible, was now seen, not as a victim, but as a woman who endured and knew how to raise her voice. And within me, a certainty blossomed. Life still had new chapters reserved. The days that followed were of rediscovery. In Donna Celeste's house, I found not just a roof, but a welcoming home. She offered me tea every afternoon, and our long conversations were balm for my soul. Little by little, I began to feel joy in small things again. I went to the market to buy fresh fruit, as I once did, without haste, choosing each detail. I started attending gatherings at church, where women my age met to talk, sing, and share stories. There, I realized many had endured similar pains: ungrateful children, absent husbands, relatives who treated them as burdens, and together, we laughed, we cried, but above all, we grew stronger. It was as though I had found a new family, not of blood, but of heart. One sunny afternoon, I sat on a bench in the square, watching children play. For a moment, I thought of my granddaughter. My heart tightened, but not with resentment. I knew that one day she would understand who I truly was, and perhaps, on that day, she would seek me out with new eyes. In the meantime, I rebuilt my routine. Not as a submissive mother, but as a free woman. I began helping in small community workshops, teaching old recipes, sharing life stories. And in every grateful look I received, I felt I was reclaiming parts of myself that had long been stifled. I no longer saw myself as a victim. I saw myself as a survivor, as someone who, even wounded, found the strength to bloom again. On my last sleepless night, Reflecting on all that had happened, I realized I no longer carried the same weight. The memories of humiliation still hurt, but not as open wounds. They were scars, signs that I had survived. I picked up the notebook where I had recorded every detail of those months. I skimmed the pages, filled with pain but also courage, and, for the first time, I didn't cry as I read them. I smiled. I smiled because I knew that story no longer defined me. I closed the notebook, placed it in a box, and said to myself, I no longer need these proofs. Life has already returned to me what was taken. My voice. The next morning, as I opened the window in Donna Celeste's house, I felt the sun touch my face gently. It was like an invitation, a call to begin again, not as the forgotten mother, but as the woman who had regained her dignity. Perhaps I had lost a daughter along the way, but I had recovered something far more valuable, myself. And as I walked to the square, hearing the sound of children playing and birds singing, I felt that life still held chapters of tenderness, friendship, and peace for me. There was no resentment anymore, only gratitude for the chance to start again, and the certainty that, even after darkness, there is always a new dawn waiting. And if it were you, would you have stayed silent, or would you have reacted sooner? I want to read your opinion in the comments.